My wife controlled me for years, until I took back my power. I didn't realize how much I'd lost myself until I was sitting in our living room, staring at the empty space beside me where my wife usually sat. Her absence was more than physical. It felt like a void, an absence that reached deeper than the surface. For years, I had been walking on eggshells, afraid of making the wrong move, saying the wrong thing, or even being too quiet. Every step in our marriage had to be measured. Every disagreement turned into cold silence. Every refusal of her demands into weeks of emotional withdrawal. It had been like this for as long as I could remember, her withholding affection like a tool, a currency. I had unknowingly become conditioned to this behavior. Her love, her touch, her warmth. They were all tied to my compliance. If I didn't agree with her, if I didn't give her what she wanted, I was met with the silent treatment. No amount of apologies or attempts at making things right ever seemed to work. The cold shoulder would linger until I caved in, gave her what she demanded, and then, like a dog trained to perform tricks, I was rewarded with affection again. I didn't realize how toxic this pattern had become until that one evening, when everything changed. The moment I knew something inside me had snapped was when she asked for the designer watch. It wasn't the watch itself that triggered me, but the way she had been pushing for it for weeks. Subtle hints that were anything but subtle. Texts, catalogs left open, even leaving me links to websites. I wasn't stingy with money. I loved spoiling her when I could, but we had just spent a small fortune on home repairs. We were still recovering financially, but she didn't care. She wanted the watch, and she wanted it now. Can we get the watch? My birthday's next month. It would be perfect, she said, her voice dripping with sweetness as she cuddled up beside me on the couch. I could see through the act, though. This wasn't a request. It was an order wrapped in a plea. I was thinking we could take that weekend trip to Nashville we've talked about, I suggested. Her face fell instantly, the warmth disappearing from her eyes as quickly as it had appeared. I had seen this look before. It was the same expression she wore when she was displeased, when I didn't fall in line. Forget it, she muttered, pulling away from me, her phone already in hand. That was when the realization hit me like a slap in the face. I had spent years trying to make things right, trying to appease her, trying to smooth over every little conflict. And for what? So she could manipulate me again and again? It was like I had woken up from a long, drawn-out dream. I was done. I was done being manipulated. Done walking on eggshells. I didn't even care if she gave me the cold shoulder for weeks this time. I wasn't going to cave. I wasn't going to apologize for something I hadn't done wrong. I simply said, fine, before turning over in bed, pretending to sleep. The next morning, I didn't apologize. I didn't beg for her to talk to me. I didn't try to fix anything. I got up early, made myself breakfast, and left for a long bike ride. It was something I used to enjoy before I'd let her subtly push me into neglecting my own needs. But today, I wasn't doing it for anyone but myself. When I got back, she was sitting at the kitchen island, staring at me with a confused look on her face. "Where were you?" she asked, clearly unsettled by my absence. "I went for a ride," I said, grabbing a water bottle. "And I'm going to meet Mark later for the game." She stared at me for a moment longer, her eyebrows furrowed, clearly not used to me acting so independent. But instead of arguing, I turned and went to shower. For the first time in years, I wasn't worried about her reaction. Felt good. The next few days were even more liberating. I wasn't tiptoeing around her moods anymore. I stopped apologizing for things that didn't need apologizing for. I started to live for myself again. I even reconnected with old friends, something I hadn't done in months because I'd always felt guilty leaving her alone. Saturday night, I went out with Mark to a bar, something I hadn't done in ages. And for the first time, it felt like I was living my life again. Mark looked at me, laughing. "Dude, where have you been hiding? Feels like I haven't seen you in forever." "Been busy," I said, grinning. "But I'm making some changes." I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing. I was done being the man who was always bending to her will. I was done being the man who put her needs first while neglecting myself. I wasn't her puppet, and I wasn't going to keep playing the game anymore. I was taking back my life and whatever came next, whether it was a change in our marriage or its end, at least I would finally be living on my own terms. And that, in itself, felt like freedom. The shift in our marriage was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like the slow change of seasons. But I felt it. I could see it in the way my wife looked at me, her confusion growing with every day that passed without me chasing her approval. I no longer tiptoed around her moods, no longer bent over backward to smooth over the tension she created. And she didn't know how to handle it. The cold shoulder had always worked before. Days of silent treatment until I finally caved, apologized, and did whatever it took to get back in her good graces. But now, when she turned away from me in bed, I simply turned over and went to sleep. When she withdrew her affection, I didn't chase it. And that alone was shaking the foundation she had built our dynamic on. A week after the watch incident, I came home from work and found her sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, barely looking up as I walked in. Normally, I would have greeted her, asked about her day, made small talk to bridge whatever distance she had created between us. This time, I simply grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and leaned against the counter, scrolling through my own phone as I took a sip. The silence stretched between us, heavy and unfamiliar. Finally, she cleared her throat. "So, I guess you're still mad about the watch thing." I glanced up at her, surprised she had even brought it up. "Not mad," I said simply. "Just done." She frowned. "Done with what?" "Done with the games. Done with the emotional punishment every time I don't do exactly what you want." I took another sip of water, my tone calm, almost detached. "You don't have to like my decisions, but I'm not going to spend my life begging for affection because I said no to something." She blinked, caught off guard. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to find the right response, the right countermove. But for the first time, there wasn't one. I wasn't playing anymore. Instead of arguing, she pressed her lips together and went back to her phone. And that was that. The following days only reinforced my new reality. I started doing more for myself. I went to the gym before work, something I had abandoned years ago when our mornings became filled with her needing me to do things for her. I reconnected with old friends, went out without asking for permission, and even pulled my old guitar out of the closet. The first time I strummed it in the spare room, I could feel her presence in the doorway before I even turned my head. "Seriously?" she sighed. "You know I hate the noise." I didn't even pause. Then closed the door. She huffed but didn't argue. She just stood there for a moment watching me, before finally walking away. It was another crack in the wall she had built between us. Another moment where she realized I wasn't bending to fit into the mold she had shaped for me. And it felt damn good. The real test came at Rebecca's birthday party. Normally, I would have been the quiet, agreeable husband, hovering near my wife, waiting for her to bring me into conversations. This time, I was different. I laughed, I talked, I engaged. When one of her friends, Jessica, asked me about my recent woodworking class, I spoke with genuine excitement, explaining the bookshelf I was working on. "That sounds amazing," she said. "My husband has been thinking about getting into woodworking too. You should tell him to go for it," I said, enjoying the conversation. "It's been a great way to de-stress." Jessica smiled, and for the first time that night I caught my wife watching us. But it wasn't her usual glare of annoyance when I spoke to her friends. It was something else, something closer to uncertainty. Like she didn't quite recognize the man sitting across the room. And maybe she didn't. Later that night, as I cleaned up after the guests had left, she leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You were different tonight," she said, studying me. "How so?" "I don't know, more present. More confident." I shrugged. "I had a good time. Your friends are great." She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, almost hesitantly, she said, "Jessica seemed to think so too." I almost laughed. Was she jealous? The thought was almost amusing, considering how much effort she had put into keeping me in the background for years. "Jessica's happily married," I said simply. "We were just talking." She pressed her lips together, then shook her head. "Whatever. I'm going to bed." And just like that, she walked away, but I could tell something had shifted. The dynamic was changing, and for the first time in our marriage, I wasn't the one trying to fix things. I wasn't the one chasing. The final nail in the coffin of her control came a few weeks later at a neighborhood barbecue. Normally, I would have stuck by her side, let her lead the socializing, nodding along as she engaged with people. But this time, I walked straight up to the guys setting up the horseshoe pit and joined in. Jim, one of my old friends, clapped me on the shoulder. "Man, where have you been? Feels like I haven't seen you in ages." "Been busy," I said, "but I'm making changes." From across the yard, I could feel my wife's eyes on me, watching as I laughed, as I connected with people. She wasn't used to this version of me, the one who wasn't waiting for her approval, and it clearly rattled her. Later that evening, as we were cleaning up, she came up beside me, her voice tight. "I'm getting tired. Ready to head home." I glanced at her. Normally, I would have immediately agreed, no matter how much I was enjoying myself. But this time, I just shrugged. "I promised Jim I'd help clean up. You can take the car if you want. I'll catch a ride with Mark." Her eyes widened slightly, clearly not expecting that response. She hesitated, then said, "I don't mind waiting." "No need," I said casually. "You've got that early meeting tomorrow, right? Might be easier for you to go now." For the first time, she had no countermove. No guilt trip, no manipulative sighs. She just stood there, uncertain before finally leaving. And when I got home later that night, she was lying in bed, pretending to be asleep. But I could tell. She had been wide awake, waiting, wondering. For the first time in years, she was the one waiting for me. And that realization, that felt like victory. The tension in our home had taken on a different shape. It wasn't the usual cold silence that followed our disagreements, the calculated withdrawal of affection that had been her go-to strategy for years. This was different. It was uncertainty. I could see it in her eyes, in the way she hesitated before speaking, in the way she watched me when she thought I wasn't looking. For years, she had controlled the rhythm of our marriage, when we talked, when we were close, when we fought, when we made up. But now the script had flipped. She was no longer leading, and she didn't know how to handle it. It was in the small moments that I noticed the shift. When I came home late from watching a game with Mark and didn't immediately seek her out, she pretended not to care but kept glancing at me over her book. When I played my guitar in the spare room and didn't ask if it bothered her, she stood in the doorway, listening longer than she ever had before. When I made plans that didn't include her and didn't check with her first, I saw her jaw tighten, but she didn't say a word. It was as if she was waiting for me to break, to fall back into the pattern of seeking her approval. But I wasn't going to. That man, the one who bent to keep the peace, who apologized for things that weren't his fault, who chased after affection like a starving man desperate for scraps, was gone. The change became undeniable when she started trying to reach out in ways she never had before. It started with small gestures, bringing me a cup of coffee in the morning, making dinner without me asking about my day in a way that didn't feel like a formality. At first, I thought it was just another manipulation tactic, another way to get me back under her control. But over time, I started to wonder if something else was happening. If maybe, just maybe, she was realizing what she had done, that she had pushed too far for too long. One evening, I came home from work to find a book on woodworking sitting on the counter. A small note was tucked inside. "Saw this and thought of you." I stared at it for a long moment, unsure of how to respond. This wasn't something she would normally do. In the past, my hobbies had been nothing more than an inconvenience to her, something she tolerated but never supported. And now, here she was, trying to show interest in something she had ignored for years. I walked into the living room, holding up the book. "You bought this?" She looked up from her phone, nodding slowly. "Yeah, I figured, I don't know. I thought you might like it." I studied her, waiting for the catch, the unspoken expectation, the favor she was going to ask in return. But it never came. She simply sat there, waiting, as if she had no idea what I was thinking. "Thanks," I finally said, setting the book down. "That was thoughtful." A flicker of something crossed her face. Relief, maybe? It was hard to tell. She nodded and went back to her phone, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she was waiting to see if I would say anything else. But I didn't. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. If she truly wanted to change, she had to prove it, not just through words, but through actions. The real turning point came when her sister announced her wedding in Colorado. It was a destination event, something that would normally send my wife into full control mode. Planning my outfits, dictating how I should act around her family, making sure I played the perfect role. When she handed me the invitation, I braced myself for the usual expectations. Instead, she simply said, "It's in Aspen, Columbus Day weekend." I raised an eyebrow, and she hesitated, shifting on her feet. I was thinking, you could wear that navy suit. You looked good in it at Jim's wedding. I waited for the rest, the usual follow-up about how I had to wear it, how I needed to make sure I got it dry cleaned in time, how I should wear this tie and those shoes. But nothing came. "That works for me," I said, watching her reaction. She nodded, then hesitated again. "I know these things stress you out. So, if you need space, just let me know." That caught me off guard. She had never offered me an out before. Every family event had always been on her terms, with no room for discussion. I wasn't sure if she was testing me or if this was genuine, but either way, I simply nodded. "I'll keep that in mind." The wedding weekend came, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was suffocating. She didn't micromanage my every move, didn't hover over me, didn't give me that look every time I wasn't standing by her side. And when her Uncle Robert cornered me with one of his endless political monologues, she actually rescued me. "Sorry, Uncle Robert," she interrupted, slipping her hand into mine. "Mom needs Adrian for the slideshow setup." I followed her as she pulled me away, glancing at her in confusion. "Slideshow setup?" She smirked. "No. I just figured you'd served enough time listening to conspiracy theories for one night." I couldn't help but laugh. "Thanks for the rescue." She squeezed my hand lightly. "That's what partners do, right?" And for the first time in years, it felt like she actually meant it. That night, as we slow danced under the string lights, she rested her head against my shoulder, something she hadn't done in a long time. "This has been nice," she murmured. I nodded, surprised to realize that I actually meant it when I said, "Yeah, it has." It didn't mean everything was fixed. There was still a long way to go. But for the first time, I saw something in her that I hadn't seen in a long time: effort. Not control. Not manipulation. Just effort. As we flew home the next day, I found myself thinking about how much had changed in the past few months. I had started this journey believing that I was walking away from our marriage, from the toxic patterns we had built over the years. And maybe, in a way, I had walked away. But instead of losing her, I had forced her to meet me where I was. I wasn't sure if we would make it in the long run. There were still things we needed to talk about, still trust that needed to be rebuilt. But as we sat on the plane, her hand resting lightly on mine, I realized something important. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't chasing her. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to chase me instead. The months that followed the wedding in Aspen were different from anything I had expected. I had spent so long preparing myself for the inevitable fallout, for the moment she would slip back into her old ways, that I didn't quite know how to handle what was actually happening. She was trying. Not in the forced, calculated way she used to when she wanted something, but in a way that felt almost real. It wasn't perfect, of course. There were moments when I could see the old patterns creeping back in. Moments when she hesitated, as if debating whether to revert to the woman she had always been with me. But every time she caught herself. And that alone was something I never thought I'd see. One evening, we sat on the couch after dinner, something that had become more common lately. She had started sitting closer to me again, though I had made no effort to close the distance myself. It was her move to make, not mine. I was sketching designs for a new woodworking project, and she leaned over slightly, watching. "That looks complicated," she said, tilting her head as she studied the rough outline. I glanced at her. "Not really. Once you get the basics down, it's pretty simple." She hesitated, then said something that genuinely surprised me. "Could you show me sometime?" I put my pencil down, studying her face, trying to gauge whether this was another attempt to get back into my good graces, another tactic to regain control. But her expression was open, uncertain in a way I had rarely seen before. I nodded slowly. Yeah, if you want. She smiled, and for once, it didn't feel like there was an agenda behind it. The next day, I came home to find another book on the counter, Advanced Woodworking Techniques. No note this time, but it was obvious who had left it there. I ran my fingers over the cover, unsure how to feel. It was such a small thing, and yet it meant something. It meant she had been listening. It meant she had been thinking. That weekend, we went to dinner at Jessica and Ryan's house. Normally, she would have been the dominant presence in the conversation, steering it toward topics that interested her, with me playing the supportive role. But this time, something was different. When Ryan asked about my woodworking, I started talking about the bookshelf I was building, and instead of cutting me off or redirecting the topic, she listened. Really listened. At one point, Jessica smiled and said, "It's really cool seeing you so passionate about something. You've always been so quiet at these things." Before I could respond, my wife surprised me. "He's always been good with his hands," she said, a hint of pride in her voice that I hadn't heard in years. On the drive home, there was a comfortable silence between us, something we had rarely shared in the past. Finally, she spoke. "It's nice seeing you like this." I glanced at her. "Like what?" "Happy." I didn't respond right away. I didn't know how to, because the truth was, I was happier than I had been in years. And it had nothing to do with her. It had everything to do with the fact that, for the first time in our marriage, I was living on my own terms. And the strangest part? She was starting to respect that. But the real test came when the holidays rolled around. In the past, these events had always been a minefield. Her family's expectations, her need for everything to be perfect, her tendency to micromanage every little detail. I braced myself for the inevitable stress. The week before Christmas, she came into the garage while I was working on a project. "So, about my parents' Christmas party," she began, hesitating slightly. I sighed, already anticipating the demand. "What about it?" She shifted on her feet. "I know these things can be overwhelming, so if you don't want to stay the whole time, I understand." I blinked. That was not what I had expected. "Really?" She nodded. "Yeah. I mean, obviously, I'd love for you to be there, but I don't want you to feel trapped." I set my tools down, crossing my arms as I studied her. "What's going on with you?" She frowned. "What do you mean?" "You're different." She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "I don't know. I guess I've been doing a lot of thinking." I waited. She took a deep breath. "I haven't exactly been a great wife, have I?" I didn't answer right away. I could see that this was hard for her, that she was actually making an effort to acknowledge the things I had spent years pointing out to her. "No," I finally said. "You haven't." She swallowed hard, nodding. "I'm sorry. For a long time I had imagined this moment. The apology, the acknowledgement. I had told myself that if she ever admitted what she had done, I would feel something: vindication, anger, relief. But all I felt was tired. "Why now?" I asked. "What changed?" She hesitated before answering. "You did." I frowned. "What does that mean?" She bit her lip, looking away. "For years, I knew I could push you. I knew I could control things and you just take it. And then one day you didn't. And I realized that I had spent so much time making sure I got my way that I never stopped to think about what I was actually losing. I didn't know what to say to that, because, in a way, it was exactly what I had been hoping she would realize. But at the same time, I didn't know if it was enough. "You've changed," she continued. "You're confident now. You don't tiptoe around me anymore. You don't let me push you. And I like that. I like this version of you." I ran a hand through my hair, sighing. "I don't know if I can trust you," I admitted. "I don't know if I believe that this change is real." She nodded slowly. "I get that, and I know I have to prove it to you, but I want to try." For the first time in a long time, there was no manipulation in her voice, no hidden agenda. Just honesty. And that, more than anything, made me pause. "I don't want to go back to how things were," I said quietly. She reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. Neither do I. I studied her, searching for any sign that this was just another game. But for once, I didn't see one. Maybe we were too far gone. Maybe the damage had already been done. But maybe, just maybe, we had a chance to build something new. Okay, I said finally. Let's see where this goes. And for the first time in years, it felt like we were moving forward together. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload.